Well, look, let's talk to someone about, actual education and actual school buildings rather than what a minister has or has not said. Mark Lehain is head of education at the think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, and joins us now. Good morning to you, Mark.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much for joining us. Before we do talk about the nuts and bolts, the actual stuff that matters to parents and kids and teachers right now, what did you make of what Gillian Keegan had to say? Do you have any sympathy for her about the fact that she is basically saying that, everyone else has sat on their bums and done nothing, and that she wasn't saying that she'd done a effing good job. She was saying her department had in actually dealing with this.
I almost wouldn't read too much into what she said. I think she was just frustrated. She blurted something out. And listen, those of us that have to do this media thing in our jobs, we've all been in a situation where we've had a microphone on or we've been near a camera and potentially said something, forgetting that we're in that point. So I think, like you said, it just shows she's human, and most people just hear it and go, oh, whatever, and move on.
Yeah, I do think, what people often forget in Westminster is most people are rather busy. Back to work this week, kids back to school, other things to prioritise. They're vaguely aware of some gaffe. They probably couldn't even name the minister, and that is often what saves them. But let's talk about, the actual nuts and bolts of this, the nitty-gritty of this. The head of the spending watchdog, Gareth Davies, he's head of the National Audit Office. He has told the Times, a newspaper, that he's accusing the government of a sticking plaster approach to essential maintenance. Hundreds more schools may contain dangerous concrete than the ones we already know about. I think it's about 126 we know about. We're going to get a definitive list, the government has said, by the end of this week. Bearing in mind, lots of people would say, well, we should have had a list beforehand. Why are schools not returning their surveys and the like? But Gareth Davies says that the government has ended up wasting money on emergency repairs because it has neglected the unflashy job of keeping buildings in usable condition. Is he right?
I think there's an element of truth to that, actually, and that is, we have over the last 20, 30 years seen a massive increase in public spending. We've seen a big increase in the amount of money that goes into, for instance, the school's budget, how much money people are head teachers. I was a head teacher myself for 5 years of a secondary school. The amount of money that we've had to play with day to day has gone up. But the amount of money being spent, invested in what we call the capital budget, buildings, infrastructure and stuff like that, hasn't always caught up for a number of reasons. But the main one is there's very strict treasury rules about what you can spend money on. And so it meant we probably have underinvested in school buildings and hospitals and stuff like that, even though other bits of the education budget have gone up.
And I am right in thinking that per pupil funding, the spending on education has gone up, but per pupil, it has gone down by 8 or 9%, has it not, since 2010?
Well, actually, it did go down for a bit after 2010 as part of the government tightening of finances then. But actually, since 2017, if you remember, there was that very successful school cuts campaign during the 2017 general election campaign. School funding, the per pupil budget in real terms, has gone up and up and up again, and an awful lot in the last few years as well. So from this September, it's back to where it was in 2010 in real terms. So the budget hasn't fallen, contrary to what lots of people say.
Although it did for crucial years, and bearing in mind a lot of that funding, for 2 years, lots of kids weren't in school for large periods of that time. So the trouble is, a lot of that funding has gone on, buying iPads and things like that, and also, I'm assuming, dealing with things like the huge extra cost of heating schools and lighting schools that we've seen with the energy crisis. It hasn't just hit homes and firms, it's hit public buildings too. The cost of, national insurance rises and minimum wage rises. All of that across the board, wage rises for teachers, that all comes out of that budget, doesn't it? So that may not actually feel any benefit in terms of what is spent on pupils.
Well, I'm often very unpopular with my friends when I point out the Institute for Fiscal Studies, what they do is actually work out what the inflation rate for schools specifically is, as opposed to the rest of us. And what they said is, with the latest increases in funding that schools are now getting, it will take funding per pupil in real terms to where it was in 2010 or just above it. It doesn't feel like it, though, in schools. No. Like you said, because of all the other pressures they've dealt with, and that's largely to do with problems elsewhere in the system. Yeah. But again, fortunately, it feels like it is a relatively small number of schools that are affected by this RAC so far. Now, for those schools, this is a huge deal. This is a massive problem. There's never a good time to have to take a classroom or a building out of use. But the start of the year is about as bad as it comes. But we do have to take a step back and go in the broader picture of things. Thank goodness, the only silver lining here is it is only about 160 schools out of 22,500-ish. So far, it feels like the scale of this is a relatively small thing. We've got to put safety first. Clearly, the evidence they had as to whether this rack situation was something they could just monitor or whether they had to do something about, clearly the evidence over the summer changed, so they've decided they need to get ahead of it. And fortunately, because it is a relatively small number, it does sound like, although let's see how it works out in practice, it does sound like schools are going to get a lot of support, each of them having this individual caseworker. The key is the government have got to find the money to make sure they're not made worse off by this. So I know there's sort of different ministers saying different things, and sometimes it sounds like they're going to pay for everything, and sometimes it sounds like they're only going to pay for some things. You know, and I know at the end of the day, politically, they'll have to find the money to cover the cost of everything here.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. There's a huge amount of money. I mean, you say, this is what we were told by Gillian Keegan yesterday. The evidence over the summer had changed. And then there's criticism of her going on holiday in the final week of August. She said she went to Spain to celebrate her father's birthday, then got caught up in the air traffic chaos to come back. But what evidence changed over the summer? Do we know?
Well, what they've intimated is that there were a couple of situations where work was being done in schools, and I don't know whether these rack stuff just collapsed or whether, because, you know, during the summer holidays, that's when most schools get the builders in to do stuff. Yeah. It would appear there are a couple of situations where rack either collapsed or was found to be at risk of imminent collapse, and that was fed back into the Department for Education. And at that point, the experts there, and they have got some real buildings experts in the Department for Education now, the experts there said, look, this sounds like we can't leave this to monitor anymore.
And if this school's got this problem, there's no reason why that school or other schools haven't got it as well. We're going to get that list by the end of the week. People actually finding out, and some of the media are actually publishing lists that they know about of schools that are affected. But the crucial thing is, for most schools, it is, you know, it's some buildings that are having to close, not the whole school. So it's not quite as disastrous as we were thinking at the beginning. Really good to get your thoughts on that, get your update on that. Mark Lehain, Head of Education at the Centre for Policy Studies.